There's no denying that I absolutely love The Legend of Zelda. It's my favorite video game franchise by far. I've made reviews on a fair amount of the games, and I've talked about Breath of the Wild specifically in my traversal video, my video game music video, and I will probably continue to talk about it more in the future on my channel. In my opinion, it's the best video game that has ever been created by far, and a fair amount of critics agree with me, so yeah, the game's pretty good. In a 2-minute review I made earlier, I gave Breath of the Wild a 10 out of 10, but it does have some very minor issues. I know, it's still very good though. Thank you. More specifically, there were 3 major things that I felt Breath of the Wild needed to improve, those being the dungeons, the story, and the items. Now that's not saying that Breath of the Wild objectively has a bad story or dungeons or items, I just feel that these specific aspects of the game have been surpassed by other Zelda games. But what Zelda game specifically has the best combinations of story, dungeon, and awesome items? That's right, Wand of Gamelon, Ocarina of Time. Oh boy, what a game. Alright, let's talk about it. The dungeons in The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild are honestly just okay in my opinion. They all have the same brownish art style, and the mechanic of moving around a certain part of the Divine Beast sort of felt gimmicky to me. It made me miss the more traditional Zelda temple formula, like with keys and items. Ocarina of Time's dungeons were so insanely creative and cool, especially the Forest Temple, Spirit Temple, and Shadow Temple. They were each filled with a bunch of different mechanics as opposed to just moving the Divine Beast, like flipping hallways in the Forest Temple or moving the water levels in the Water Temple. These made the dungeons so memorable, challenging, and rewarding. Also, the bosses in each temple took the game mechanics you just learned and used them all together in an awesome way. Each temple had their own unique and distinct boss, and it was amazing. The bosses in Breath of the Wild are all extremely similar. Although they do use runes in unique ways in very specific instances, Ocarina did this in a much better way without a doubt. So imagine if in Breath of the Wild, the dungeons were more akin to Ocarina of Time's. The story in Breath of the Wild is definitely good, but not amazing. Because it's an open world game, it seems logical that the story would be less engaging than in a more linear game. But Breath of the Wild seemed like it still could be better. The majority of the story is told through optional memories, which are neat, but I would definitely prefer if it was more traditional. The thing about Ocarina of Time's story that makes it so engaging is that it really feels epic and meaningful, and it's very interesting. Ocarina's story has more twists, more interesting characters, and furthered the Zelda lore in a way that every other game has failed and probably will fail to replicate. The ending left players with so many unanswered questions and set up so many potential sequels, while Breath of the Wild's ending was more basic Zelda. Imagine if Breath of the Wild set up a totally new timeline in the Zeldaverse. That would be insane. It sort of felt like Breath of the Wild played it safe in the story department, so I think it could be improved. Ocarina of Time's story consisted of super engaging cutscenes and an awesome twist ending, as well as more complex characters. Imagine if Breath of the Wild's required cutscenes were more than just riding the Divine Beasts, but if the story had more actual depth. To be fair, there's a ton of fan service in this game and the story, which I absolutely adore, and the same cannot be said for Ocarina. But still, Breath of the Wild's story would be much better if it had the same depth as Ocarina of Time's. One other idea that I had is about the memories in specific. One of my favorite moments in Ocarina of Time is turning from young Link into adult Link and seeing how Hyrule has changed with all of the undead and whatnot. Imagine if Breath of the Wild had this mechanic as well and allowed you to walk around in Hyrule before the apocalypse. Now you may be saying, wouldn't they have to redo the entire map without any of the guardians or monsters and so on? But I counter that argument with this. Imagine if the memories and cutscenes in Breath of the Wild were more like the memories in The Last of Us Part 2. Most of the cutscenes before doing a Divine Beast consist of Link riding the Divine Beast with its respective champion. But imagine if instead of just looking at the cutscene, we could actually walk around. The Last of Us Part 2 perfected this concept and turned memories into short gameplay sessions where you got to see the world before all of the chaos. If Breath of the Wild adopted that mechanic, you could see firsthand what the world in Breath of the Wild looked like before Ganon took over. I feel like that would be so cool, and Ocarina nailed the concept, so you know Nintendo could do the same again for Breath of the Wild. A huge problem that a lot of people have with Breath of the Wild is the item system. Essentially, in Breath of the Wild, there are a massive variety of different swords, shields, and bows to use, which all have somewhat different characteristics. The issue with there being so many of these weapons out there is that the weapons themselves are very vulnerable. The positive being that your arsenal of weapons is constantly changing and improving, which is awesome. But Ocarina of Time approached items in a way which I personally prefer. Instead of there being multiple different variations of a single item, there's a variety of different items. Like instead of there being multiple swords taking up inventory slots like in Breath of the Wild, Ocarina only has one sword and the inventory slots are filled with completely different kinds of items, like the hookshot, lens of truth, Megaton hammer, magic beans, bomb chew, Deku nuts, and all of the great fairy fountain abilities. Breath of the Wild does have boomerangs, Deku leaves, bows, different types of arrows, bombs, and of course the runes, but I still sort of wish more items like those were in the games. I would also love Breath of the Wild to keep the current system with a variety of swords, so that players can choose to have a variety of that weapon, but if they added the hookshot, lens of truth, etc. into the game in certain areas and they took up an inventory slot, that would be so awesome. One item specifically that I feel like could be especially amazing in this game would be the ocarina itself. Imagine if fast travel in Breath of the Wild required you to learn songs like you do in Ocarina and play them to go places. The current fast travel process, while it's very efficient, isn't all that fun, and the loading screens are so annoying. Ocarina definitely did a better job of making fast travel more interactive and tied in with the game itself. Also, you may be saying, there's so many shrines and towers and divine beasts, so you'd have to remember so many songs. But I think if Breath of the Wild still had its mechanic for shrines but used an ocarina for Rito Village, Sora's Domain, Goron City, and Gerudo Town, it would be very effective in pulling the player into the world. This would also allow for a ton of Easter egg and fan service opportunities, which is always a plus. At the end of the day, Breath of the Wild is the better game than Ocarina of Time. The way it approaches exploration, world design, survival, traversal, and more makes it soar above the competition. But Ocarina of Time is the better Zelda game in my opinion, since the actual quote-unquote Zelda part, that being the story and the dungeons, are way more intriguing in Ocarina of Time than in Breath of the Wild. In essence, Ocarina of Time has a better story and dungeons, but getting to and from those dungeons is really tedious and not that fun. Breath of the Wild still has good dungeons and a great story, even if it is worse than Ocarina, but getting to and from those places is almost a game in itself. The abundance of shrines, Korok seeds, survival elements, and different villages, labs, weapons, and more makes moving around Breath of the Wild extremely fun. As such, if these two games combined and Breath of the Wild had Ocarina's dungeons, story, and items, it would undoubtedly be the greatest video game ever made. Thanks for watching the video and have a good one. Peace.